don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere.
Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to the channel if this is your first time. This is a very important book review that I'm doing today, and it links in with the banned books project, the 24 for 24 banned books project that MJ started reading in this life. And I really wanted to read this. I kind of skimmed through it before. I've had it quite a while, and I didn't feel like I properly read it, so I properly read it this time. And I absolutely love it. It's a fantastic book. It's a graphic novel, and it's called Persepolis. And it came out in 2000 it was written in 2001, and it was translated in 2003. So it came out for English people or an English audience an English-speaking audience in 2003. So it's written by Marjani Satrapi, and it's basically a significant contribution to a non-fiction bibliography of Iranian history. It's from her perspective. It's like an autobiography, but it covers Iranian politics in a very deep and powerful way. And it covers her childhood and going into her teens, and this is actually the complete Persepolis, so it's actually 2 parts. So you can get Persepolis 1, you can Persepolis 2. This particular edition is both parts together, so she does go into her older age in the second part. So it's called Persepolis because it's named after the ceremonious capital of Iran. So that goes back to 550 BC, and it's kind of also the name for the city of the Persians. So there's a reason why she calls it that, and she does start the book with a very short introduction which goes into some detail about Iranian history. So before the actual graphic novel element starts, she does give a bit of background about Iran, which is really, really important. Obviously, historically, it used to be Persia, and Persian history is full of conflict and survival, if you like, which is why there's a lot of Iranian pride, national pride in their culture. And religion features very highly in their culture as well, and that is explored in this book. So the first book is basically covering her past from the ages of 10 to 14. So when the book starts, she's 10. It does go a little bit further back, or in sort of reference to further back, but that's where she is when she starts. So when the book starts, she's 10 years old, and it basically goes on from there. So when she's 10 years old, it's 1979. And from 1979 to 1988, Iran goes through a huge change. So in 1979, there's the Iranian Revolution, and that changes the country completely because the revolutionaries take power away from the Shah and create this very strict, authoritarian, you could argue, an out-of-date fundamentalist regime, and changes Iran completely away from what the Shah had achieved for a more modern Iran. And it makes a significant difference to the country, but to these individuals, to Marjane and her family, it's documented here how that plays out for them and their friends and the people trying to rebel against this very archaic Iran. So that happens in 1979, and not that long after that, from 1980 to 1988, there's the war between Iran and Iraq as well. So that changes things again. But mixed in with all of this, all of the historical changes in Iran, is her relationships with her family and her relationship with religion, and how some of their friends and neighbours are affected by the fundamentalist regime that takes over after the Iranian Revolution. So her parents are Marxists, and because of that, they encourage her to think freely and to question everything. And that kind of sets out this sort of the tone of the book. And that's a really important dynamic in the book, what her parents are like. Her parents are always trying to encourage her to question things and to publicly rebel, but also they get more and more afraid of her safety and security in Iran as she does this. And the new regime is quite an oppressive regime, and people are punished and tortured for very small things, and everything becomes very like a political touchstone, political football, you know. So the spectre of repression is on every single page of this book, and throughout the book, Margie's drive is to live authentically and true to herself. And that's inspired by her grandmother, who's a really interesting character in it. She kind of keeps coming up now and again to encourage her to be this sort of more free-thinking person in a country that is against free thinking. So it's a really important document of that kind of oppression. She struggles with her relationships and fitting in. So she always feels frustrated by this, and she says on one panel that she feels like she's never ever going to feel comfortable in any situation. So there's a situation that she's in where she's trying to pretend that she's not Iranian, and it is clear that she can't really sustain that for very long because they don't believe her, and she just feels like she doesn't fit in anywhere. So that's an aspect of the book as well. But it becomes a series of uncomfortable truths in this book, and there is some really intense parts of it. There is torture in this. There is very clear evidence of the oppressive regime and what they do to dissidents, or actually not even just dissidents. So the demonstrators in the Iranian Revolution get punished, but actually you can be punished for really mild things, you know, for not wearing the veil, and for there's a moment where they try and import a poster of Kim Wilde, the UK pop singer, over like they kind of hide it and get it through customs, and they would have been imprisoned and tortured for having a poster of Kim Wilde. So any kind of references to Western culture is punished severely. So that kind of thing, it's very shocking, some of the elements of this, and I found it deeply fascinating, deeply moving, and very important as an educational tool, as well as the fantastic way that Margie's characterised in the book as well. So I think there are some parallels with Mouse, because it's another historical document done in graphic novel form to tell a very personal story amongst oppression. But because I knew so much about the Holocaust, I love Mouse. I think it's a brilliant book. But this was much more powerful for me because I learned quite a lot about Iran and about the Iranian Revolution through this book. So if you feel like you don't know a lot about the situation in Iran during the 80s, then and the whole kind of the way that the Ayatollahs changed the country, then yeah, definitely this is a nice way in. This is a good way. This could be like a stepping stone into a more in-depth academic look at Iran. But it's really, really good. It's very powerful. It's very emotional. So and another thing that is kind of interesting with this book is her relationship with God. So obviously religion features highly in this book, but her parents are atheists, and she's not an atheist at the beginning. She does reject God when her uncle Anoush is executed, and as the Iranian Revolution develops. So she does reject God, but before she does that, she keeps using him as a process of her thinking process. So like it'll be like she'll wonder what God thinks, or she'll ask him questions, and he appears now and again until she rejects him because of her uncle Anoush being executed. The actual way it's drawn, I think, is really interesting. So I think the plainness of the text as well, by the way. The way that the actual language of the text is quite childlike and really it draws you in. And I think it does sound like a 10 to 14-year-old. It's very cleverly done because you're getting really important information. And it kind of makes it a little bit more emotive because it feels like a young voice. So I think also the actual drawing style is quite basic, which works really well. And some of it's symbolic. So there's a bit where they're talking, like you've got some things like this. So those heads being in her father's thoughts, and there's some kind of more symbolic images, while there's also a more straightforward domestic portrayal there, and I think it really, the expressions on the faces tell a lot. I think it's beautifully drawn, and it really does hammer home what's going on. So yeah, the actual drawing style I think works really well. The text is brilliantly done. So I do think that the actual presentation of it, not just the ideas in it, but the way it's written and the way it's drawn is fantastic. The narrative highlights Margie's professional and personal ambitions and how they're tied to education. There's a big theme in the book. And both those things, her ambitions personally and her ambitions professionally, are destroyed by the patriarchal oppression that the new regime gives. And this weaving of these two things is, again, brilliantly done. It's very subtle in some ways, because both these things are quite significant things in the book, but you don't notice them so much. You're just reading it, and it's not kind of like pounded on you like sort of like an overdone repetitive point. It's relatively subtle in that sense. The wearing of the veil and the severe banning of anything that links to Western culture that they see as decadence is part of this growing conflict that Margie's got in school, and that leads to the conclusion of the first book, because she gets expelled and there's lots of issues where she just keeps questioning things in school. And her parents are worried about her safety, so they say that they kind of trick her in a way. She kind of sees that she's going to get tricked, but they sort of say to her that she's going to have to. They're going to have to collectively move out of Iran, but what they're doing is just making sure that she does, so that she's safe. So the conclusion of the book is really heartwarming. The last moment in the book. And that's partly because you really care for the family. You really care for Margie, and you care for the parents. And that is a real testament to how powerful this is done, how well it's drawn, and the way that the dialogue within the book makes you really care for the characters in it. So that's how part one ends. And then book two is set in Vienna. And that's where she goes through totally different experiences, and they are linked to her growing up and discovering sexuality, discovering drugs, and these new issues of a different kind of security and a different kind of identity issues. So they are similar things. They're definitely linked. But because you're in Vienna, it's not that kind of security about being tortured, but it's that security about her own fitting into Viennese society and not feeling like she's safe from being bullied or that kind of thing. And there she does experiment with sexuality and drugs through the story. She is happier and freer in Vienna. There's no doubt about that. But she still doesn't feel like she totally fits in. And she doesn't feel like she belongs. And I think that's a really interesting thread running through both books. And I don't think I'm spoiling too much to say that my favourite part of the book, because you invested so much into the character and you think so much of her, my favourite part of the book was in part two, the second book, when she gets visited by her mother, and it's so beautifully done. It's just I just felt really, really, really moved in a way that I wasn't expecting, and the first book, you're moved and disturbed by the torture and the oppressive regime. And because that goes on to a different kind of situation for Margie in the second book, I was really moved by how much Margie and her mother was moved by her visiting. And I remember being physically emotional in those scenes. My heart was pounding and I got goosebumps, and it was just a beautiful thing. So I think that's a testament to the book. So, yeah, I think this is a fantastic book. I think it's done brilliantly. It's possibly my favourite graphic novel. I'm not sure. I'm going to say that in this review, and I'll have a think about whether that's true. But I think it is. I keep thinking that whenever I think about this. I will probably read it again in a few years. I think it's a really good introduction to Iran. It's just beautifully done. You do really care about the characters in it. So if you're tempted, definitely check this one out. And by the way, there is another version that I've had for ages, but I quite like this because it's slightly larger, and I think that works for a graphic novel because obviously it's about images. There's one that I actually prefer the cover of the other one. So I would suggest a more famous cover, a more familiar cover maybe, that is really good. But I quite like this because it's larger than a normal mass market paperback. So I think it works with graphic novels. But anyway, it's a moot point. Definitely read this. Oh, and just to talk about the fact it was banned, because I haven't talked about it yet. It's really interesting actually, because in the Middle East, it's not actually had that much of a challenge, which is interesting because I thought that was going to be the issue. It has had a little bit of a challenge, but not much. And in Lebanon, it was banned for a bit, and then the Lebanese intellectuals complained, and it was kind of released from its ban. So it didn't have much of a furore in the Middle East, but it has been banned in Chicago. So that's kind of interesting. So again, we're going back to America for this issue of banning books, and that was only recently. So that was 2013 when it started getting challenged. And for the Chicago schools, they think there's too much disturbing images of torture, and there has been people saying, in response to that ban, that they are also including books about the Holocaust that has worse images. So it's interesting because actually the images in here of the torture is kind of stylized. So again, I think because it's that childlike view, so it's not even really graphic and sort of brutally done. So it's a bit of a funny ban, and you do wonder if it's more than that. I don't know if they're worried about the way that the book questions the oppressive doctrine of the fundamentalist Iranian regime, or not. I don't know. It could be that. But that's why it's banned in Chicago, which is bizarre. So there we go. So interestingly enough, I was surprised when I found out there wasn't that much of a challenge in the Middle East, and it's actually Chicago where it's had the most issue. So there we are. Read Persepolis because it's really, really good, and I think you'll be moved as well as educated. Thanks a lot for watching. Stay curious. What strange power we have to exterminate the past, to annihilate the evidence of alternative belief. What strange lack of wonder, what strange lack of awe at the infinite stretch of space, at the beauty in the stars.